we want people on a learning curve. We hope that everyone around us is on this kind of learning curve. And that means that there are going to be times where people feel like they're getting out of their comfort zone and they're learning new things and new ways of doing things. And then if they fail, we can point that out and accept it. Like we're not harsh about failure at all. And we certainly, maybe above all, don't make the mistake of identifying people with their shortcomings or failures.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be back here with you.
Hey, Sharif, great to be back.
Yeah, Kevin. Well, last week we talked about cognitive dissonance and self-concepts and self-justification. And one of the things that you put forward is that to overcome these self-concepts and to get out of this cycle of self-justification, it's helpful to experience yourself without any self-concepts. And this kind of sounds a little bit like mindfulness, where you're trying to completely quiet your mind and achieve interior silence without any thoughts. So would you say that is mindfulness a way of overcoming cognitive dissonance?
That's an interesting question, Sharif. I think there is this fascinating link, right, between experiencing yourself as you really are versus your kind of idealized self, your self-concept. And it's true that we talked last week about how when we were justifying ourselves, it really is the self-concept defending itself. And so I think to go deeply into this, there are two things. One is what it means to experience yourself immediately. But the other is also, what is the self-concept defending itself against? And I think that we'd have to say that it's defending itself against shame. So shame is a feeling we have when we're afraid that our failures will be made known to others, that in some way we are disgraced in the eyes of others. So it's a fear of failure. It's a fear of disgrace. So the emotion that is that fear is shame. And so I think we could say that the emotion that will accompany cognitive dissonance is the emotion of shame. And mindfulness of shame then would be the way out of it, to attend directly to the emotional experience.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that we talk about when talking about fear is the need to retrain the amygdala, which is the brain's threat detector. But the amygdala doesn't understand language, so you can't really reason with it, and you teach it through your behavior. But it seems like with self-concepts, there's more of a conceptual or reasoning element to it, that you maybe have a certain irrational self-concept or false self-concept, say. But is it possible to reason with it? Or are you saying it's kind of the same as in the case of fear and the amygdala, that you don't want to reason with it? It's more of a training it through your behavior, in this case through mindfulness.
So you could attend to the self-concept directly, but in its essence, the self-concept is a model of yourself. So it's a model that's built in a way to defend you against shame from your failures or shortcomings being perceived by others. And we can feel shame about anything. It doesn't you could feel shame even for being good if you're around bad people. You can feel shame for deformities, Aquinas says, even though there's no responsibility there. It's just the way that you were born. So we can feel shame for anything, but the self-image that we try to build up with our accomplishments and outcomes, all the outcomes we seek are in some way trying to build up the self-image, because those are all left-brained things, and they're a strategy in some way to buffer us against shame. So it's often seen in psychology that shame is the emotion that when we avoid it, it has the biggest impact on the structure of our life. So it's architectonic. People will choose a career path or a spouse based on how much they buffer them against shame. And it is, I think, the most commonly exiled emotion, to use the IFS language. It's the emotion that most people are most trying to bury and to not experience. And so we have a self-image that we make. The self-image is what we show to others. It's the kind of facade that we put on, sometimes deliberately, just to be social and how we present ourselves. But we have to be careful about, are we actually avoiding the real chances we have to grow because of our self-image? It's like, I remember being young and being on a soccer team and not being particularly good at soccer. And so the whole thing was a kind of shameful experience, like where I didn't want to have to do it. And so at some point I gave up soccer. And my parents never forced me to do anything. So they were good and supportive. And, but if I really didn't want to do something, then I didn't have to do it. But I can see now that it was only a kind of self-image that I was protecting by avoiding soccer. I could have doubled down on the skills and be like, okay, where could I really improve here? And I could have worked on it. And so, instead I read books. So it wasn't all bad, but but my soccer game didn't improve. But you can still see that there's a whole course of life, in a sense, that not playing that sport that developed in me just because I didn't want the embarrassment of being bad at it. If I could look back and say, wow, that is just being on a learning curve. And that shame was a harbinger of growth. We were talking last time how cognitive dissonance points out the way of growth. Well, really, it's because that's, it's the things that we're not good at. It's our limitations that we would like to hide from others. Well, that's where the growth needs to happen. And the better we are at accepting that and accepting the growth, the more we can lean into it and actually change who we are.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked about shame now in the context of these kind of bigger areas of life, like your career path, or I don't know, as a kid, what sport you play, that can be a big deal. How would you talk about bringing that into some of the smaller things that we do day to day, like each golden hour?
Yeah, isn't it true that when we are working, if we are moving from this kind of left-brained approach to work, which is about getting things done, well, that's the same part of our system that keeps the self-image intact. So we like to do work the way we have always done it because we know what to expect. So it doesn't really pose a risk to our self-concept. But if we sit down and try to do something in a completely new way, that then will have a risk of failure. So if we over-rely on the known strategies, the over-practiced strategies, because of fear of failure, well, that's actually because of shame, the avoidance of shame. So I think that it's all the time in work, that we rely on how we have always done something. That's true. Sometimes we do that just because it's more efficient. Because doing something in a new and better way is never more productive or efficient at first. But a lot of times we do it because we're afraid of failing. So we know that we can basically pull off a task with this strategy, and we don't want to try a new one which might fail. So the real question then is, how much does fear of failure limit how we work? So I can think of imagine someone cooking a meal for their loved ones. They could rely on doing the same recipe, the same thing every time, simply because they're afraid of failing. They know it works. And to try something new, well, if it didn't work, then they would look bad, and so they don't do it. So it seems to me that shame avoidance is what hampers innovation, always. So think of it like a student going to class. Well, if he or she were to be afraid of appearing bad in the eyes of their classmates, they wouldn't ask the questions that they need to ask, because they would be maybe afraid of being seen as they might not know, is this a good question? Is this a bad question? So a lot of times when people are just learning a new subject, they don't know what all the other people in the class know yet. And so that can be embarrassing if they ask a question and reveal their ignorance. But the more shameless they are, in the sense, actually, the more, it's funny, we call it shameless, but in fact, the more they are willing to have the shame there and just ask the questions that they need to ask, the more genuinely they grow. And then the more their kind of the love of learning gets lit in them. So, and that can then, again, be a completely new path for them in learning a new subject.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. So you gave the example also that one of the reasons why you use strategies that you've always used before is for efficiency. So it seems like that could be the fear of failure. There's one dimension of it where you don't want to appear, as incompetent. So there's kind of a shame that goes along with that. But there is also the dimension of it that you want to do high quality work. You want to produce something that, say, actually solves a problem, or every profession has its own goals. You want to actually achieve those goals. So how does a person kind of do that internal reflection where they're discerning, okay, am I doing this am I following these rote strategies because of a fear of failure, because of shame, or because, it's actually important that this thing be accomplished?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's, I think, where mindfulness comes in. So the more mindful a person is habitually, I think the more able they are to be aware of this fear when it's rising. The shame is a species of fear. So you feel it in your chest. And it's a kind of tension that's there. It's interesting that it's been said by psychologists that it's actually a feeling, a sensation that makes you want to hide on the ground, to somehow get underground so that you can't be seen. And I've experienced that when there's something really embarrassing that happens. You feel the fear, but it's kind of like there's an urge to hide so that you can almost, it's how real it is to get on the ground and lie down. So I'm not saying people need to be, doing that to be mindful, but you can be mindful of the urge, and you can be mindful of, whoa, what is, I'm feeling here this kind of fear of failing in this. So the more accepting the person is of that feeling, the more they can use it as a kind of guiding light, because it just means that there has been an area that has been off limits for growth. So they need to bring then to that a sense of curiosity, and thinking of possibilities. So what is there about this that I could get better at with practice? The shame will get easier with practice. So the more eager you are to be on a learning curve, so the more you make progress in any one area of life where you really learned how to, I'm not saying you have to do this in every single area of life simultaneously, but choose one area that's important to you. And look, in that area, is there any particular kind of, how has fear of failure been holding me back? Is there a way that if I could be more welcoming of that fear, letting myself feel the fear that's in me, then I could start stretching myself and practicing new ways of doing things. I could emulate the people who I think are really good at this kind of thing and start getting better at it myself. So having role models that you can use that kind of guide how you want to be shaping yourself is an excellent way of starting to uncover new forms of growth. But you might feel daunted at first. And that dauntedness, that's what we're talking about, that you're daunted because you're afraid of failing. And that is a perfectly normal fear that we have before something that's new to us. So shame isn't bad. Shame, it's a normal thing that we would feel this. And it can apply to things that are genuinely bad to do. Like, we could be ashamed of acting in a bad way. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about simply the fear of failing at doing something new.
Kevin, could you clarify the relationship between this shame and self-concepts and then on the one hand, and then anxiety on the other hand? Because you've talked a little bit about fear. It kind of seems like shame or fear of failure would really give rise to a kind of anxiety Like, for instance, if you have a fear of embarrassment or humiliation, that's what we're talking about here, a fear of this kind of shame. But then that might lead you in a public speaking context to get anxiety about public speaking. So is that the normal trajectory, that this fear of failure and unwillingness to experience shame gives rise to anxiety? Is that how things tend to go?
I think that every anxiety disorder is specified by the kind of thing that triggers it. So, and the fear of failing or being perceived as a failure is common to all of them. So I think it's a common root that we do not. I mean, so one of the problems with panic disorder is not just that we're afraid of having a panic attack, but it's also the fear of being seen to have one. So that there's always this component, but it's so general and it's kind of so fundamental that we never talk about it. So it's interesting how shame hasn't really played much of a role in the understanding of psychology. There's very little written about shame per se. And I don't think we've really improved on the writings of Aquinas. So, he had a lot of discussions of shame, and he's the one who talked about it as a fear of failure, being perceived by others. And he had a lot to say about, it could be about the past things, retrospective, or it could be about future things you're about to do. And so he, I think, had the deepest understanding. But maybe the most fundamental thing I think you can see and glean from his writings, he doesn't say it explicitly, but that humility really is the acceptance of shame. And the greatest examples of humility are the people who have welcomed the greatest shame. Not for its own sake, but for the good that they could do through it, or some good to be obtained. And he uses the example of the humility of a leper, who kind of shows himself fully so that he can be healed. It's this idea that is there in him, that the virtue of humility is what allows us to open up and accept shame entirely. So that humility is this willingness to have shame. And in a way, it makes shame then irrelevant to our behavior. So that we don't do things, pursue particular outcomes. We don't pursue things like wealth and power and position, to buffer ourselves against shame. No, we instead are willing, to experience shame, provided we're doing what's right.
Okay, then a follow-up question I have is, how, as someone in kind of like an authority role, I don't know, like a manager or maybe even a parent, how can they encourage this kind of humility in other people? And I think particularly about, say, a manager in a business, that they have to balance. On the one hand, they want the people working for them, their direct reports, to be growing and to be, I think, willing to face up to areas where they want to grow or where they need to grow, to kind of experience shame in this way. But at the same time, they want to encourage results, that, hey, the team is achieving its goals, we're achieving our objectives here. So how would you advise a manager to encourage this, but also balance it with the team achieving their objectives?
Yeah. And that's a great question. I guess this idea, again, that humility, as we're discussing it, is simply the acceptance of shame, the acceptance of the fear of failing, so that failures or mistakes are not overly guarded against. So you can see then in an organizational setting, do you have, as an organization, a way of trying to prevent all failures by not giving people responsibilities? You could easily imagine a manager who won't delegate anything because they're afraid that if they delegate, the person will fail. But we have to be willing to let people fail and learn from their mistakes, and have a culture where it's okay to make mistakes. That we want people on a learning curve. We hope that everyone around us is on this kind of learning curve. And that means that there are going to be times where people feel like they're getting out of their comfort zone and they're learning new things and new ways of doing things. And then if they fail, we can point that out and accept it. Like we're not harsh about failure at all. And we certainly, maybe above all, don't make the mistake of identifying people with their shortcomings or failures. Instead, we just see, no, there's a learning here that has to take place. So we help people to like, you can actually have, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why that it's been pointed out that like great CEOs are notable for their humility. And that means their willingness to admit their own mistakes because they're willing to feel shame, and to have a culture around them where it's not a shaming culture. You can imagine like a shaming culture where somehow mistakes are punished, and there's a culture of be perfect, not be growing.
So, okay, actually, this kind of gets to a point. I was listening to another podcast, and he was talking about learning and memory, and that, so basically when you're trying to remember something, using the method of forced recall, that you try to kind of dig deep to remember it, and that's how you actually encode the memory more deeply. And so as you're doing that, you're kind of quizzing yourself with content that you're trying to memorize. If you can get 100% on that quiz, you weren't challenging yourself enough, and so you're not going to be able to memorize it as well. At the same time, if you only get 10% right, you're not actually encoding memories very well because you're not getting anything right. So he says that the sweet spot is about 90% for the rate at which you should be succeeding when you're quizzing yourself to maximize this kind of memory encoding. And it seems like a similar thing. Maybe you could have a similar kind of rule here where you want to fail about 10% of the time, and that helps you kind of develop this experience of willingness to experience shame, but at the same time be getting good results. Because you wouldn't want to have someone just going out seeking failure all the time and just fail as much as possible just to kind of experience more shame. But you do want people building on their strengths and developing these skills, right?
Yeah, that seems right. Clearly in medicine, there are important ways we don't want people to make mistakes. So and so we have to protect against that. So what we're talking about here is there may still be areas where you do have to improve how you work. I remember, for instance, learning how to do hypnosis. So now, if you've never been the hypnotist in a session with someone, it's kind of it's a step that's a real big step because you're going, and so you could imagine that, okay, like it could fail and the whole thing could be experienced negatively. So, but I think I had gotten used to doing mindfulness with people and guiding them through that and doing different types of smaller visualizations. And so I kind of just built my way up to actually being able to do hypnosis. So I use smaller steps to get like comfortable with things. And then the first time I used it, it was with a patient who was requesting it and was a longtime patient, and we had a great rapport, and I was okay failing. And he was okay too. And so, but then he said it was one of the most, and he had actually been to a star kind of hypnotist before, but he said that session was his most effective session ever. He felt and so it was only because we were so close that it wasn't a risk for me to fail, and I was willing to try it with him. But then that feedback made me want to try it again and again and again. So, and I kind of learned how to use hypnosis as a way of doing exposures that you can't do in real life. So that ended up being, I don't do that as much anymore, but it's an important part of like me learning how to maximize exposures and to eventually kind of simplified it. So I think the other thing that's interesting in that 90% rule is that's what I think of terms of in a given day, how productive or efficient can you be? I think that if you try to be 100% efficient in your use of time, you cannot be recollected. Staying recollected all day long, you can only be 90% efficient. And so you aim, so that's what I've been telling this to people, you aim for 90%. So because like you have to slow down, think about things briefly before you do them. Try to really be, and this is how we talk about like the golden hour. You can't do golden hours and be at 100% efficiency. You had to be willing to slow down, pause, be less efficient, but in the end, you're trying to ask, like, how can I do this in a better way? How can I do this in some new way? So that takes a little bit of time, but it's well worth it because that is what allows for growth. So I think it's very like linked to what you're talking about, that the willingness to be not performing at your best, not be as performing as maybe efficiently as you could, that has to be accepted so that you can actually improve.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, Kevin, we're basically out of time here, but I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to add.
Maybe just this, that there is an aspect, here to how we experience ourselves when we are, what do you do when you're being mindful of the shame? Is that where your attention ultimately rests? And I think that the answer is no, that we can use the awareness of shame as a kind of doorway to just be more aware of ourselves as we are. And two things happen here. One is, I think we start to actually experience ourselves as being younger and younger. That there is something about children that make them not afraid of failing. And so not to have the fear of mistakes, particularly young children. And I think we can start to recover that spirit within ourselves. The price you have to pay to become young is the willingness to accept shame. So to accept being on a learning curve and to kind of be comfortable with having a long ways to go. So I think that's one of the deepest things. The other is that, we become more aware of ourselves simply as we are at this moment. And so I think humility in the end isn't just mindfulness of shame. It's actually a mindfulness of yourself being. So, and to feel that deeply, and to experience it more and more as a gift. So that there's really nothing that we have that we haven't received. So that everything we have in our life is a gift. So somehow the awareness of being young and the awareness of the gift, it seems to me like those are some of the fruits that humility gives, that really make us then completely willing to experience shame. We're not afraid of it. In fact, we see we can, there's a joy to be found in being humble. This is something we're always needing to work towards, because I think shame is just second nature. And the fear of shame, which is pride, is second nature. So we always have to be working against it. But there's a lot of joy to be had. And
that then gives us this kind of sense of freedom in being able to love others and commit ourselves to the most important bonds that we have with others.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of a very liberating thing.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that shame is never really about bonds. So the acceptance of shame makes us then more capable of bonding with others.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, Kevin, I think that's a very deep note for us to end on here.
All right, sure.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.